Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Smythe, Executive Director of the Hippogriffs History Channel here in London, England. Here I am in front of a replica of the 1607 Godspeed that took the original 104 settlers from Great Britain to North America, thus creating the prelude to the United States of America. In this series of documentaries about antebellum United States 1812 to 1861, I have the pleasure of introducing 14 distinguished scholars who are experts in this field of American history, all from some of the most prestigious universities in the world. In this episode, I'd like to introduce a distinguished historical scholar and a leader in the field of North American slavery, the Honorable Professor Abbas Safi from Yale University in Connecticut. Amongst his notable publications are the New York Historical Society Prize winners From Slavery to Emancipation, 1620 to 1865, and All Men Are Created Equal. I will now leave you in his capable hands to discuss life as a slave driver in antebellum United States.
Welcome everyone to episode 11 in our series of documentaries about the antebellum United States, 1812 to 1861. In the previous presentations, we discussed life as a northern factory owner, life as a northern factory worker, life in the rural north, life as a woman and child in the north, life as a new immigrant in the north, life as a Chinese immigrant in the west, life as a southern plantation owner, life as a southern plantation owner's wife and child, life as a skilled slave, and life as a house servant. I am Professor Abbas Safi, a scholar at Yale University, and I am now going to discuss life as a slave driver during the antebellum period of U.S. history. An overseer was a young white man who was usually the son of a well-established slave owner. He was hired to supervise the daily affairs on a plantation. They were also supposed to keep the slaves in control. On the other hand, a slave driver was an older enslaved male of African descent who was appointed after years of hard work as a slave. Overseers were assistants to the plantation owners. They were often the sons of wealthy slave owners who were learning about plantation life. They were one day expected to run their own plantation. Some of these men were violent alcoholics who were taught to have very little value of human life. They were unable to hold a job and often shifted from one plantation to the next. They directed the daily activities of the slaves and what they were to do through their long work hours from dawn until dusk. Their job was to maximize crop production. The plantation owners were often away, sometimes for months, and overseers often took over the job of the owner and had complete control of the plantations. Slave drivers were former slaves who were assistants to the white overseers who supervised discipline and organized the productivity of slaves. They decided the punishments and rewards for the slaves. Plantation owners selected a slave driver who he could trust to keep the slaves in line and increase crop production. Slave drivers were slaves of African descent promoted to the position of slave driver by the plantation owner or overseer, with the primary objective to speed up the production of tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugarcane. Slave drivers had a well-established reputation for being obedient and diligent. Most slave drivers were 30 to 40 years old, although some were younger. Many retained this position until their 60s, having the slave driver as the middleman improved the relationship between the slaves and the overseer. The slave drivers worked alongside the white overseers on the plantation. On smaller plantations, they worked under direct supervision of the plantation owners. The slave driver was equipped with a whip to beat the slaves if they did not behave or do their work. Slave drivers were needed to motivate the workers. If slaves didn't perform at their best, they would get beaten. The slave drivers, in short, kept the workflow moving. Most were not liked by the whip the slave drivers used to beat the slaves was called the cat of nine tails, which was a knotted thong of cord featuring 9 knotted cords, each 2.5 feet long, protruding off the end of the handle, with hooks at the end of each cord. It was designed to rip apart and tear into the flesh of all that were beaten with it. The whip caused immense pain in an attempt to get slaves back to their work. This whip, although equipped to slave drivers, originated from the flogging of crew members aboard vessels of the British and United States navies. Being whipped in the Navy was usually reserved for the worst of offenses. Slave drivers lived with the regular slaves and their families. They were still considered the property of the plantation owners. The slave drivers and normal slaves lived in small wooden shacks with dirt floors, very little furniture, or anything to ensure their comfort. The slave houses usually lined the driveways of the plantation mansions because it showed off the owner's wealth to the visitors. The slaves and slave drivers only got about 4 hours of sleep every night because of their tireless work schedule. The slave drivers' weekly rations consisted of cornmeal, lard, a bit of meat, molasses, peas, greens, and flour. The meat was usually pork or beef, but some evidence shows that it could have been opossum, raccoon, snapping turtle, deer, duck, squirrel, or rabbit. This food was barely enough to keep them working during the day. When slave drivers and slaves were on a plantation that wasn't as successful as others, they often received little to no food every week. They also grew their own food on Sundays if they were given a day off. The slave drivers and slaves would have to make their own food. In the mid-1800s, slaves usually costed about $1,000 or $40,000 in today's money. The lowest price paid for a slave was around $250 or about $10,000 in today's money. The highest price paid for a slave was about $1,750 or a staggering $70,000 today. Price usually depended on multiple different factors such as being young, fit, and male. They were more productive and lived longer. They were better value for money. Females were also important because they produced children and future slaves. Slaves started working at around the age of 10 when they became capable of field work. If they worked hard enough and followed strict orders, they would eventually be promoted to the role of slave driver by the age of 30 to 40. Slave drivers usually had a long working life and retired when they got too old and weak to work anymore around the age of 70 to 80. Many of them died prematurely either from punishments, illnesses, or bad working conditions. Slave drivers usually stopped working by getting fired or because someone better came along. Slave drivers enforced slaves to carry out certain tasks assigned to them by the plantation owner. Slaves had to clear new land, dig ditches, cut and haul wood, slaughter livestock, and make repairs to buildings and tools. If they were skilled, they may have worked as a blacksmith, slave driver, carpenters, or other tasks that required some level of skill. Children slaves on a plantation lived in constant fear of being sold away from their parents, punishments, and isolation. They usually worked in fields with adults, tended to animals, cleaned their owner's house, did chores for the owner, and even took care of younger children when their parents were working. Slave drivers could have been sold at 8, but when they turned 10, they were definitely vulnerable to being sold off a plantation. Slaves were punished by slave drivers for many reasons, usually underperforming with their productivity. The reasons for punishment included not working fast enough, not working efficiently enough, being late to the fields, defying authority, running away, and many other reasons that may sound absurd to us today. There were a number of punishments that were given to slaves by slave drivers and overseers. Sometimes slaves could be punished in front of other slaves or family members to teach them a lesson and to prevent them from repeating offenses. If a slave were to run away, they were to be punished physically by whipping or getting beaten. They could also be shackled to prevent them from escaping again. If they escaped successfully, they would not automatically gain their freedom. If they were caught, they would be sent back to the plantation and receive punishments. One of the worst recorded punishments was called the derby's dose. This punishment proceeded with a guilty slave to endure a flogging, then have lime juice, pepper, and salt rubbed into the wounds. There were different levels of punishments for different offenses, like mutilation for running away. Most punishments were commonly given to the offender for running away from their plantations. Slave drivers were people of African descent who were former slaves who went out into the fields and made the slaves do their work. An overseer was a white male who oversaw the running of the plantation when the owner was away. Slave drivers held an important position on a plantation and therefore had extra privileges such as better clothes and more food. The field slaves trusted the slave drivers more than the overseers because they were one of them. Both the slave drivers and the overseers had the right to physically punish the slaves if they did not obey orders or work at their hardest. This relationship continued until the American Civil War, which ended with the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery in North America forever.